Hey guys, welcome to another video. My name is Ian. Welcome back to the channel Ian the Reader. Today I have a very exciting top 10 list for you all. That being my top 10 Stephen King books that I have read as of November 2024 when I'm filming this video. The reason I wanted to make this video now is because if you don't know, I am co-hosting a Stephen King book club now through the end of 2025, possibly on past that, with my good friend Jake over at the Bookish Drummer. We are co-hosting it on his Discord, which I'll leave linked down below, but I kind of wanted to do a before and after of my top 10 Stephen King books with this book club. So I've read a lot of Stephen King books, but I have not obviously read all of them yet. I've read almost 50 of his books, which is a ton, but I somehow still have over 20 books left to read. So I'll get to them as soon as possible. Most of the books we're reading for this book club are books that I have not yet read yet, so I'm very excited about that. But, like I said, wanted to tell you guys my top 10 favorite Stephen King books as of right now. Before we jump into that, though, I did want to say a couple things. First, there are a couple books that I haven't yet read that I think could be on this list eventually. The three that I have in mind in particular are Different Seasons, Night Shift, and Christine. Those three I am particularly hopeful about and I think could be on this list. There are also two books that I have read, but it's been a long time, and I think upon reread they might move up my list. Those books are The Green Mile and The Shining. So keep that in mind. These are not going to appear on my top 10 list, but I am very confident that I will either enjoy these a lot on reread and move them up, or when I finally get to them for the first time, they may have a chance of being on this list. There are going to be, inevitably, some books that you think should be on this list that are not going to be there, and I'm going to put some books on this list that you think don't belong on a top 10 list, and that's okay. With books of all kinds, we are all entitled to our opinions. Our opinions are totally valid, and that's one of the most beautiful things about books, is that we can all have completely different reading experiences with them. My list isn't the right list, it's just my list, and I would love to know what your list is. So jump in the comments, tell me what your top 10 favorite Stephen King books are, or what your number 1 is, or top 5, whatever you want to do. Just let me know how you feel about Stephen King. Without any further ado, let's jump in to my top 10 Stephen King books. Coming in at number 10 is a book that I absolutely adore and I read last year. That book is Insomnia. I love Insomnia. This is honestly an honorary Dark Tower book. It's a book that has such heavy ties to the Dark Tower world. Some characters are mentioned a little bit in the story, and it plays into the ultimate climax of the Dark Tower series, but it can be read on its own. Not only, though, are there going to be some Dark Tower things, but this also does take place in Derry, Maine, which is the setting for quite a few Stephen King books, including it. But Insomnia is an incredible story about an older man named Ralph. I believe he is in his 70s, and he's kind of coming towards the end of his life. And I really loved that about this book, that we had an older protagonist, because most literature focuses on people who are younger, and having somebody who is retired and has so much life to reflect on, I found to be really, really interesting. But Ralph has a chance encounter that kind of shakes him with one of his neighbors who isn't quite right, and from there he gets this insomnia, and he also starts seeing some really weird things going on around town. I loved this book. It was super wacky and went in a lot of directions that I didn't anticipate, and it's one that completely took me by surprise. Like, of the books on my top 10, there's maybe one or two others that I was more surprised to love as much as I did than Insomnia, but this book is one that I absolutely loved. I don't recommend the audiobook, even though I listened to it, because it does this super obnoxious thing where there will suddenly be music playing throughout the book, and it's the most loud and ridiculous music that you could possibly imagine. It's so distracting, so read this physically, but Insomnia is a super underrated Stephen King book. I highly recommend it. Coming in at number 9 is Stephen King's debut novel, Carrie. I love this book. I know that it's not everybody's favorite. It feels like a debut novel to a lot of people, but for me personally, I felt like this is a near perfect debut. I loved the way that this story is told, and it's interesting. I feel like this storytelling has to work for you, and if it doesn't, then you're probably not going to enjoy this book, because some people feel like the tension is kind of removed from this book, because we get little installments throughout the story of people kind of talking about what happened at the climax of this book. If you don't know what Carrie is about, we follow a teenage girl who is in high school and is really having a hard time. Not only does she struggle to make friends in high school, but her mom at home is really, really terrible to her. But she also has some weird psychic kinetic abilities that are starting to manifest, and all of this kind of comes to a head around prom season at her high school. I love this book. I think it is exactly the right length, which is so nice to say about a Stephen King book, because with many of his books, he just goes on for such a long time. And sometimes that works, and sometimes it absolutely doesn't. And for Carrie, I felt like this was the perfect length for this novel. It was short, it was snappy, it was concise, and I ate it up. I loved this book. I was on the edge of my seat, not necessarily because I didn't know what was going to happen, but emotionally, just the dread that built throughout this entire book. It was so fantastic. I felt so deeply for Carrie. I felt for some of the people around her as well, but not a lot of them, because there's some terrible people in this book as well. But ultimately, I think this is an excellent novel, and one that Stephen King should be so proud of the fact that this is the first book he put out, because in my opinion, it's a near masterpiece. In the number 8 spot, we have The Wastelands by Stephen King. This is the third book in the Dark Tower series, and this is really the one that made me fall in love with the Dark Tower series. I did not like The Gunslinger when I first read it. Upon reread, I enjoyed it more, and upon a third read, I enjoyed it a lot more. And the second book, The Drawing of the Three, was good, a step up for sure, but it wasn't until The Wastelands that I finally got it. I finally understood what the hype around this series was. If you don't know anything about the Dark Tower, it is really Stephen King's magnum opus, not only in its original 7 books in the series, but really most of Stephen King's books have some sort of ties to the Dark Tower series. It is a multiverse, epic, wild, unpredictable series full of amazing characters, unbelievable twists and turns, and just so many different genres that come into play. You've got horror, you've got fantasy, you have westerns, you have just so much stuff. There's so much stuff that goes on in these books, and this was truly Stephen King just writing whatever the heck he wanted, which I truly admire. And sometimes that works for him, and sometimes it doesn't, but for the Dark Tower series, it worked really well for me, and I felt like The Wastelands is the epitome of the Dark Tower series. You finally have all of the characters gathered together. They're on their way to travel to the Dark Tower, finally. Everything's kind of falling into place, and this truly embodies to me what this series is, and so I think it is truly worthy of being in the top 10 books. I love this book. If you somehow read all of the Dark Tower series and The Wastelands isn't at least one of your favorite books in the series, maybe we read different books. Who knows? Coming in at number 7, we have Hearts in Atlantis. I love this book. It's such an interesting one because I think it's technically classified as a novel, but really it is a collection of novellas that are all interconnected, and it's amazing. What is so interesting about this book is there are some horror elements in it, but really this is just a moving historical fiction novel that takes place really around the Vietnam War, both early on as the effects of it are not yet seen whatsoever, and then carrying on past the war to the trauma that was dealt out as a result of it, and the characters that are changed forever by it. I think that this is one of Stephen King's boldest novels, because it really does some things that I think his audience maybe wasn't necessarily along for the ride for, and for that reason I understand why it's a little bit underrated, but it's one that absolutely worked completely for me. Not only is there an incredible novella that starts the story called Low Men in Yellow Coats, but additionally the follow-up stories beyond that are shorter than the first one, are incredibly impactful, and it really just puts you and in the mindset of what society and what the United States was like during the Vietnam War. Not only people who served in the military, but people who knew people who served in the military or were worried about whether or not they were going to be drafted to go serve. It was just an incredibly moving novel, and a really transporting one as well. It's one that I really felt completely invested in. I really love the first portion of the story as well, because again, there are some Dark Tower connections in this book. You don't really have to have read The Dark Tower to enjoy this book. I just think that it is an added layer to the enjoyment, and I'm really glad that I read it when I did. This is such an incredible book, so underrated, and I love it so much. So much heart in Hearts in Atlantis. Okay, my number 6 spot is Pet Sematary. So this is one that I really went back and forth on, but the more that I think about it, the more that I just really admire what Stephen King did in this book. In my opinion, and I think in Stephen King's opinion as well, this is his scariest book. This is a book that is chilling just constantly throughout the reading experience. If you don't know what it's about, we follow a family that moves to a new neighborhood, and very soon after they move there, they meet their neighbor who shows them this cemetery for pets. And that's weird enough, but when tragedy strikes, the family, things take a very, very dark turn very quickly. This is a very pessimistic novel. It is one that deals very heavily with grief and trauma and loss and pain. Pain, my friends. But it's also, again, one of Stephen King's boldest and most just unforgettable books. It's one that I have thought about a lot. I don't like the feeling I get inside of my heart when I think about this book, but that just shows how effective it is at the same time. So that's really why I struggled to know where to put it on this list, or if it even belonged on this list, because I don't feel good thinking about it. But at the same time, I have to admit that Stephen King did an incredible job with Pet Sematary. It's one of his most popular books, and it deserves to be. Pet Sematary is a masterclass in horror fiction. Okay, so we are now in the top 5 of this list, the 5 best Stephen King books that I've ever read. These all belong here, but particularly spots 3, 4, and 5 are somewhat interchangeable, and books 1 and 2 go back and forth all the time between the two of them. So keep that in mind. But here we go. Coming in at number 5, we have Misery. I think that Misery is just a perfect suspense novel. It's horror, but light on the horror, more on just like a locked room suspense thriller book. And I think that it is just non-stop tension. My goodness, from the very beginning of this book to the very end, Stephen King does not let up on the tension. And it's another one of those books that I think is perfectly paced and is perfectly lengthened, or it's the perfect length. It's not too long, it's not too short. Every single page feels like it matters. Every single page feels like it adds to the tension, and it just is a wild ride. If you don't know what Misery is about, somehow we follow Paul Sheldon, who is an author who gets in a car accident at the very beginning of the book and is rescued by his #1 fan. Sort of rescued, because she ends up holding him captive, he soon discovers, and things take many, many dark turns. And this book is just, it's incredible how Stephen King managed to do so much with such an isolated setting. You really don't leave this house for the book at all, and you really only spend most of your time with the 2 characters in it, but it just feels like endless in the most amazing way. Misery is something that could very easily have been poorly handled by a different author. I think that other authors have tried to do things like this and failed, and Stephen King just pulled it off so magnificently. Misery is a perfect starting point if you haven't read any Stephen King books, and man, it's amazing. Coming in at number 4, we have The Dead Zone. I love this book, and for a long time, it was in my top 3. It got bumped down this year, which is crazy to me. I thought it would always be in my top 3, but The Dead Zone is really an underrated book in my opinion. It does have a movie adaptation, but I feel like people don't really talk about it as one of their favorites as often as they should. This is one of Stephen King's earlier novels, and it is the first of the Castle Rock books that are followed by Cujo and The Dark Half and Needful Things, and some others as well. But it really is the beginning for quite a series of books that ultimately are interconnected, but not like a series itself. But The Dead Zone follows a man named John, who at the beginning of the book is in a terrible accident. And throughout his trauma and recovery and healing, he gains some new talents, and we'll leave it at that. But this is a book that, again, just goes for the fences, really makes some interesting and bold decisions that I did not anticipate, and it has an ending that I think about a lot. I think The Dead Zone is another one that is not too long and is a really great starting point for Stephen King as well. Really, The Dead Zone and Misery, I think, are 2 exceptional starting points for people who are trying to get into Stephen King. And The Dead Zone is one that's kind of underrated, so I highly recommend you pick it up. You won't regret it. The Dead Zone is fantastic. Okay, my number 3 spot is one that is a bit controversial, to say the least. It is The Dark Tower, Book 7, which is called The Dark Tower. This is a very divisive book within the Stephen King fandom. It is the conclusion, of course, of the Dark Tower series, which is a 7-book main series, but there's also like a book 4.5 in there, and additionally there are so many books that are tied to the Dark Tower. So Stephen King really had set himself up here for quite the trial as far as whether or not this book would be approved or regrettably hated by his audience. And for me, it worked. I love this book so much. The emotional beats in this story are unreal. The character moments, the climax, the long, incredibly grueling journey that these characters have been forced to go through. It just, I find so much satisfaction in this book. But I also recognize that there are some moments that won't be satisfying to everyone, and I can live with that. I think that Stephen King really went for an honest approach to this story, and I completely get that some people don't like it. Like, I'm not saying this should be in your top 10. All I'm saying is that it is on mine. There were moments in this book that made me think that this is one of the greatest series ever written, and it has an ending that I think everyone who reads it will constantly think about and wonder, was it the right ending? For me, it was. So, The Dark Tower 7, unbelievably good, my number 3 Stephen King book. So if you are a constant reader of Stephen King, you probably are wondering, which of the super popular books am I going to leave out? Because there are a couple that you'll probably expect to be at the top of this list, and we'll see what ends up happening. But my number 2 book is one that has at times been my number 1 favorite Stephen King book, and that is 11/22/63. Please don't mind my beat up copy of it with holes and all this fun stuff. But anyway, this is one of Stephen King's most popular, more recent books. It came out over 10 years ago at this point, but compared to a lot of these earlier classic long books, I think this is really one of the most well-beloved books of more recent times as far as Stephen King's writing go. But it's so deserved. It deserves all of the love, all of the attention, all of the acclaim, because this book is incredible. If you don't know, this follows a man who, through a series of circumstances and chance encounters, ends up being able to travel back in time by stepping into a closet in a diner. And he is given the task of going back in time to stop the assassination of John F. Kennedy, because people believe, I guess, that really was what spawned a lot of bad things that happened in the world. And so he goes back in time to the 60s to try to stop this assassination. But we really live with him in this world for quite some time, because he has to go back in time to a very specific time. So he doesn't go back to 1963. He goes back like 4 or 5 years before that. So he has to go back in time and live there for a while. This book is so excellent because it perfectly balances historical fiction with sci-fi, fantasy, and horror. I think that it is one of Stephen King's most human stories. It's a love story. It is an adventure story. It is unpredictable. And you really just get Stephen King's incredible gift of being able to display like a hometown and a small town feeling. He does that so well in this book, and some people have complained that that part is slow when you're just kind of living in this town with the main character. For me personally, I absolutely loved it. I think this is a story that past Stephen King couldn't have written well, and I think that it was written at the perfect time for him, and he truly pulled it off. This is a book that I just adore. I adore this book so much. Unquestionably, I adore it, which ultimately is why I often move it to my number 1 spot, is because the number 1 spot I definitely have a qualm with. But let's talk about it. If you haven't put it together already, my number 1 favorite Stephen King book as of right now in November 2024 is It. Yes, this book is incredible. It is so good. Yes, there are some things that Stephen King did that I question to this day, but I cannot deny the fact that this is one of the greatest stories ever written. And additionally, it has some of the greatest character work, some of the greatest coming-of-age story moments, some of the scariest passages, some of the most creative passages. This is an iconic book. It is so good. It's long, but it deserves to be long. It is insane, but it pulls it off. It is just such a good book, and it's the book that made me fall in love with Stephen King's novels. I read this very early on in my Stephen King journey. I'd only read maybe 3 or 4 books before that, and when I read it, I immediately knew Stephen King is a favorite author of mine, and he always will be, regardless of whether or not I love all of his new releases, which I don't. It is a book that I will never forget, and I'm so grateful that I read it. We have, of course, the incredibly iconic antagonist of Pennywise the Clown, as well as the incredibly memorable protagonist group of the Losers Club, who we follow as children and then later as adults as they have to face this great evil in their hometown of Derry, Maine. You know what this book is about. You know that it is iconic for a reason and that it deserves so much of the praise it gets. It is definitely a commitment because it is very long, but it is one of the best books ever written, one of my top 10 favorite books of all time, and a book that I love so, so much. But that's all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know, like I said, what some of your favorite Stephen King books are. I know we probably don't agree completely. If you had the same top 10 as me, I would be utterly shocked, because I think everybody has at least a little bit of varying opinions on Stephen King's books, which is one of the most wonderful things about his fans. So yeah, thank you again so much for watching. Like and subscribe if you haven't already. I post videos every week, and I read a lot of different stuff, so I'd love to talk about books with you. Also, don't forget to join the Stephen King Book Club if you're interested. Here is a graphic showing the 12 books that we will be reading in 2025. Super excited about it, and we're also finishing up with The Shining and Dr. Sleep in 2024, so it is a great time to join the book club. We're so excited about all these books that we're going to be reading. Thank you again so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will see you next time. Bye!